This story is going to be hard to hear because it involves the suffering of multiple black people and multiple black families. Some of the victims I'm going to tell you about had nothing to do with the incident that started this entire ordeal. But this story is black history. This is the black history that reflects the truth and the reality of what black people have endured. This is not the kind of black history that makes you feel good after hearing it. This is real and honest and painful black history, and it's the kind of black history that must be told. In the period before the Civil War, white men frequently exploited black women, often fathering their children. It was common for white men to have their first intimate experiences with enslaved black women. By doing this, the white men could get the gratification that they wanted without compromising the purity of white women. Despite the exploitation that black women face, because of their status and their race in society, black women had virtually no means to seek justice or to voice their grievances. Following Reconstruction, one aspect of white-led redemption of the South was the terrorizing of black women by white men. The Klan and other militant groups brutally attacked black men, but their numerous attacks on black women were less well known. Many times, these attacks were committed in the presence of their husbands. There are countless stories of black women being violated in their homes in front of their children and their husbands who were powerless to do anything to stop this. Black women were often denied ownership of their bodies, and this mistreatment of black women by white men continued largely unnoticed throughout the Jim Crow era. It was this mistreatment of black women that started this entire horrific incident that I'm going to tell you about. The early 20th century in Harrison County, Texas, was a period that was filled with racial tension and violence. Lynching was a brutal reality for many black residents at that time. Between 1897 and 1912, Harrison County witnessed numerous acts of mob violence where alleged crimes committed by black individuals often resulted in immediate and lethal retribution from white mobs. It was this environment that led to the tragic story of the black people I'm going to tell you about. Before I tell you what happened, I have to tell you about the people involved. Give me a few moments to tell you about each of them. It's important that I tell you who they are and where they come from so that their humanity is recognized apart from the brutality they face simply because they were black. First, let me tell you about Mary Jackson. Mary Jackson was born in 1874 in Harrison County, Texas, to Samuel and Violet Jackson. Samuel was originally from Georgia and worked as a farmer, while Violet was born in Mississippi and cleaned houses. Mary was the third youngest of 7 children, growing up in a bustling household. By 1900, she had 2 children of her own, Cleveland, who was born in 1894, and Nancy, who was born in 1897. Mary never married, and she raised her children alone and later worked as a housekeeper and a cook. Despite her hard life and her illiteracy, Mary managed to provide for her family and maintain close ties with her neighbors and those in her community. Next, let me tell you about George Sanders. George was born around 1858. He also spent most of his life in Harrison County. He was a farmer and known to be a good person. George could not read or write, but he was well respected in the community, and he was married for over 30 years, but he had no children. Finally, I want to tell you about Teenie and Alice Sneed. Teenie Sneed was born around 1893 to Adeline and Valentine Sneed. He grew up in Harrison County with his 8 siblings. Teenie could read and write and worked as a laborer and as a farmhand. In 1911, when he was 18 years old, he married 17-year-old Alice Dahies. Alice was born into a good family that valued education. Together, Alice and Teenie had 2 children. Jake, who was born in 1911, and Rosalie, who was born in 1912. Now let me tell you about the Strange family. They were longtime residents of Harrison County. The head of the family was Joseph F. Strange. He was well known in the community. He had 4 children. His oldest son was Paul Strange. It was Paul's actions that caused 4 black families and an entire black community to suffer. Around 1910, Mary Jackson went to work for Paul Strange as a housekeeper and a cook. She moved into a small house on the Strange's land in Elysian Fields. George Sanders, Teenie, and Alice Sneed all lived close to her, and they all knew one another. This entire tragedy started because Paul Strange was obsessed with Alice and would not take no for an answer. He felt that he was entitled to her body. The conflict arose from Paul's persistent and unwanted advances towards Alice. For years, Paul had been obsessed with Alice and had been harassing her. On many occasions, he had told Alice that if she would just run Teenie off, they could be together and that he'd support Alice and pay for her to go to school. Alice rejected his efforts every single time, but Paul would not leave her alone and would not take no for an answer. On January 29, 1912, Paul came to Alice and Teenie's home. Alice was in bed at the time. He knocked on the door and told Alice that he wanted to come in and warm his feet. Alice refused to let him in. He then walked to another door and asked Alice to get him some water and said that he would not do anything to her if she just let him in the house. When that didn't work, he then escalated. He said that he'd burn the house down with her in it, or that he'd fire so many rounds into the house that it would destroy the house and Alice. At the time, Alice had a 1-year-old son and was 4 months pregnant with her and Teenie's daughter. Alice told Paul that she loved her husband Teenie, and she said that he was a good man and that she would never leave him or do anything like that to him. She begged Paul to leave, but Paul refused to leave. Earlier that same day, Teenie had dinner at his mother's house and then went to Mary Jackson's home. Mary had told Teenie that she feared for his life because of Paul's attraction to his wife, Alice. Mary told Teenie that she had overheard Paul earlier that day saying that he was going to take Teenie's life, all because he wanted Alice, and Teenie stood in the way of this. Paul had managed to gain entry into the Sneed's home. Once inside, he went for Alice. Alice's brother John Henry Jacobs tried to stop Paul. When Teenie arrived home, he found Alice terrified and her brother John trying to stop Paul from attacking Alice in their bedroom. Teenie defended his wife. He and Paul began arguing and fighting, and the commotion spilled into the street. Paul threatened to take Teenie out. To defend himself and Alice, Teenie took out his weapon and fired at Paul. After Paul died, news of what happened spread quickly. The white citizens of Harrison County were outraged and they wanted revenge. Teenie was afraid that he'd be lynched, so he fled town immediately. And his fear was justified. Harrison County had a long history of racial terror against black people. In 1907, there was a mass lynching of 5 black people after an argument about profit sharing, and several more black people had lost their lives the same way during that time period. In fact, no one was ever held accountable for what happened to those black people. Many black residents left town for fear that they'd be harmed as a result of what happened to Paul Strange. Teenie's own father, Valentine, he fled town. When Teenie was on the run, white citizens took their anger out on the black residents who stayed behind. Alice's brother, John Henry Jacobs, he was whipped and beaten by white men. White men with rags on their faces, they also beat Alice's father, Austin Jacobs, and the mob also beat Alice and her mother, Charity Jacobs. The mob captured Alice and then they took her to a cotton field. There in the field, they made her strip and laid her 4-month pregnant body over a stump and whipped her severely with a rope. After they were done whipping her, they told her that she and her family had to leave town by the next morning. After 5 days on the run, Teenie was caught on February 9, 1912. Harrison County Sheriff J.C. Sanders, he caught Teenie 120 miles away in Van Zandt County. Rather than bringing Teenie back to Harrison County, he took Teenie to the Rusk Penitentiary, 160 miles away, to prevent Teenie from being lynched by a mob. Now, this was a smart move because 3 days after Teenie was arrested, on February 12th, a mob of white men came to the Harrison County Jail and demanded that Teenie be handed over to them. It was only after they were allowed to search the jail to prove that Teenie wasn't there that they left, but they still wanted revenge, so they found other black people to take their anger out on. Now, this is where the story takes an even more horrific turn. After learning that Teenie was not at the jail in Harrison, the mob went looking for revenge. Sometime late on February 12th or early on February 13th, the mob came to the homes of Mary Jackson and George Sanders. The mob dragged both Mary and George out of their homes and took them across the county line to Panola County. Once at Panola, they tied ropes around their necks and they tied them to a tree and they hung both of them. But their deaths were slow and agonizing because their necks did not break immediately. They died a very slow and painful death. Mary's 16-year-old son, Cleveland, he was the one that discovered her body hanging from a tree. He was told by J.F. Strange, a relative of Paul Strange, that his mother's body was hanging on a limb down the road. Cleveland said that he went to find his mother and found her and George hanging by their necks with their hands tied behind their backs. Since the mob couldn't get their hands on Teenie at the jail, the mob settled for Mary and George, who had absolutely nothing to do with Paul Strange's death. Now, it was common for mobs to substitute one black person for another when law enforcement protected their target, but it was rare to see a black female used as a substitute. The police made no efforts at all to arrest and prosecute the mob for what they did to Mary and George. In fact, public opinion supported the mob's actions and blamed Mary and George for what happened, suggesting that they were somehow involved in what happened to Paul Strange. Finally, on February 16, 1912, an official investigation into the deaths of Mary and George was opened, but this investigation was nothing more than a formality. It was not taken seriously at all. The investigating body made no real efforts to identify the members of the mob who had taken George and Mary's life, or hold anyone accountable. After a quick investigation, Justice of the Peace W.M. Hightower, he found that Mary Jackson and George Sanders had died at the hands of parties unknown. Harrison County officials knew that the attention was on them and they wanted to avoid another lynching, so they took steps to protect Teenie long enough for him to be tried. As Teenie's court date approached, he was taken from Rusk Penitentiary, where he was being held for safekeeping, and then moved to the Harrison County Jail. During the relocation, he had 2 militia groups walk alongside him just to keep him safe. This was done because there were still those out there who wanted to form a mob and carry out their own form of justice on Teenie for what they believed he had done to Paul Strange. These 2 militia groups stood guard outside the jail 24 hours a day for a week until Teenie's trial was over. There were even some stationed inside the courtroom during Teenie's trial. Other measures were also taken to ensure that a mob did not seize Teenie. The militia members were ordered not to consume alcohol at all while they were protecting Teenie. Teenie's first trial began at the end of February of 1912 and lasted less than a week. The prosecution relied heavily on witnesses that supported their version of events. Teenie's defense suffered greatly because two of his most important witnesses that supported him and knew the truth, they were lynched. The all-white jury deliberated for 41 hours and could not agree on a verdict. 10 jurors voted to find Teenie guilty and sentence him to life in prison, while there were 2 other jurors who voted to acquit Teenie of all charges. Teenie was then taken back to Rusk Penitentiary to await his second trial. Teenie's attorney knew that Teenie would not be able to get a fair trial in Harrison County, so his attorney filed for a change of venue for the second trial. They used the lynches of Mary and George and the fact that Teenie had to be protected by 2 armed militias as evidence that there was no way that Teenie would be treated fairly in Harrison County. To the surprise of everyone, the judge agreed. He said that Teenie could not get a fair trial in Harrison County. He relocated Teenie's case to Anderson County, Texas. Teenie went to trial again on July 7, 1913. This trial lasted only 3 days. At his second trial, he was even more at a disadvantage than his first. Many of the witnesses that testified on his behalf were not able to be located. His wife, Alice, was unable to testify, and so were Mary's son, Cleveland, and several other black people who knew what happened and how Paul Strange had attacked Alice and had said that he was going to harm Teenie. The jury once again was unable to reach a verdict, but the state did not give up. The state tried Teenie a third time. Teenie served his time, and after his release, he lived the rest of his life in Anderson, Texas, in Grimes County. We don't know what happened to Alice. She really simply disappeared, and she can't be found in any records from that time. It's presumed that Alice died before 1920 because census records show her children living with her mother until they reached adulthood. Teenie went on to remarry and have more children. He died in 1972 at the age of 87. Teenie got what Mary and George were denied, which was a trial. The mob took the law into its own hands and deprived Mary and George of what black people really got back then, and that is justice. This story is important because it highlights what justice looked like for black people. No matter the circumstance, Jim Crow always wanted to produce the outcome that it wanted and that was right for injustice and not for fairness and equality. I want to know your thoughts on this story. Had you ever heard this story, and how did it make you feel learning all that these black people went through? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.